Today we're going to talk about the 5 most common problems we see with marriage-based green card cases. Some of these problems are things you might run into a little bit more if you're doing the case yourself. Some of them are universal problems that we run into even as experienced attorneys, but we know how to work around. We hate to focus on sort of the negative side of things, like here are all the problems and stuff like that, but it actually is super valuable to think about what types of problems you might encounter, because it helps us to work ahead so that we either avoid these problems altogether or are prepared to resolve them if they actually occur in the case. So let's jump in. The first most common problem we see is having the incorrect version of legal documents. There are a gazillion different documents that are going to be required as part of this process, right? That you're going to have to send to immigration. Some of those are going to be maybe documents here from the United States. Other documents would be documents from the immigrant's home country, things like birth certificates or divorce decrees and things like that. And so it's actually a little bit of work to figure out which version of the document you're supposed to send in. It's pretty common that we'll say, can you give us your birth certificate? And they'll send in their birth certificate and we'll say, actually, this isn't the right version of your birth certificate. And they'll say, what? I've been using this my whole life for the last 30 years. No one's ever told me there was a different version of this particular birth certificate. And we'll say, I know immigration's a weird, kind of a different beast, but so it's important that you have the right version. So I'm going to give you 2 quick tips that will help cut down on that. First of all, if it's a foreign document, not from the United States, there's actually a database online, and you can find it on the National Visa Center website, which is part of the Department of State. You can Google reciprocity table, and this database online actually shows you the exact specific version of every type of document for every country in the world. So you can say, hey, what version of my divorce decree should I have if I was divorced in India? And you can look it up and they'll tell you. You want to double check all your foreign documents against that database before you send them in. For US documents, we don't have a similar database for every state in the United States. I kind of wish we did. But you definitely want to just check and make sure you have the most complete version of whatever you have. If there's a longer form version of a birth certificate, for example, from your state, you're going to want to get the most complete version that's available legally. And for something like a marriage certificate or a divorce decree, you're never going to want to have a ceremonial certificate like the fancy one that maybe your pastor gave you when you got married, or whatever officiant you used may have given you one. You're going to want something that actually came from a government office. So it would have a clerk's signature or something showing that it was issued by the state or the county is what makes it an official document. Because of all these complexities, having the incorrect version of various legal documents is by far one of the most common problems we see in marriage-based immigration cases. The next most common problem I see with marriage-based immigration cases is problems with the financial sponsorship documents. So one of the requirements when you're petitioning for a family member, whether it's a spouse or a different family member, is that you have to show the US government that you have the financial ability to take care of that immigrant when they come to the United States. Sure, they're going to get work authorization and things like that eventually, but the US government just wants to make sure that they're not allowing a lot of immigrants into the US with no way to care for themselves, really no one who has their back. So the person who petitions for their family member has to make a promise that says, hey, I'm going to take care of this person, at a certain level above poverty level, and just make sure that they're okay for a certain length of time. So sometimes the petitioner, they're willing to promise that, but maybe they just graduated from school, or they stay home with their kids and their spouse works, or they're retired, or, a million reasons why on paper you might not look like you're able to financially sponsor someone. So we see a lot of issues with people trying to figure out whether they're eligible. The good thing is that even if the petitioner, the person who has the legal relationship with the immigrant that they're sponsoring, even if they don't qualify to be the financial sponsor, they can bring in someone else as a joint sponsor. So figuring out whether you have a joint sponsor or whether maybe you can show maybe you don't have enough income to qualify based on your job alone, but you have some property, some equity in property, or you have retirement savings or something like that. And so sometimes there's another way to show that you're eligible in a less traditional manner. Otherwise, finding someone else who's willing to help and finding the documents that show that they're eligible, those are all huge questions that come up in family-based cases. That could be a 100-hour class. So we're not going to turn this YouTube video into that, but just so that you're aware, issues surrounding financial sponsorship, and then issues surrounding how you prove that someone qualifies to be the financial sponsor are typically common problems that come up in this type of case. Another super common issue that comes up in family-based cases, especially marriage-based cases, is not having sufficient relationship evidence. In the instructions to the various forms, one of the things that you have to submit is to show that you have a relationship to the person that you're petitioning for. In the case of a marriage, it's not as easy as just showing like a birth certificate, or just a marriage certificate. You have to actually show that not only are you legally married, but that you've also have this type of relationship where you're really intending to join your lives together. For most people, that's going to be living together if they're able to be in the same country at this point. Sometimes the immigration system keeps us apart or other life things keep us apart. But usually living together, joining your finances together, traveling together, there are lots of ways to show that. But so sometimes when people take a look at that list, they say, hey, you know what? The immigrant doesn't have a social security number yet or doesn't live in the US yet. So we pretty much don't have any of these suggested things. And so maybe they send in a couple of photos or just a handful of things, and that's not going to be enough. And it's super important to, in a case like this, you want to put your best foot forward and have a good solid amount of evidence up front. Otherwise, you can get yourself on this other track where the government finds you suspicious. So it's better to get yourself initially in the bucket of, yes, these people look totally legit and we think that this is probably going to work, versus you sent in 2 selfies and it looked like suspicious. You just don't want to look suspicious. So you want to have sufficient evidence of the relationship. Super important. Sometimes people don't like taking photos. They haven't made many of their accounts together yet or things like that. And they kind of are maybe still starting the process of joining their lives together. And so that can be a huge issue that comes up. Sometimes you just have to be creative to overcome that and figure out where the documentation is that can show your relationship. Sometimes if you literally just got married, just started living together, and you just don't really have that kind of evidence yet, it might make more sense in your particular case to make sure that you have everything established on paper before you actually file your immigration case. So that's definitely a huge thing that comes up in these type of cases. And another problem that we see that has to do with relationship evidence specifically is that maybe you have plenty of evidence, you have enough, but it's actually inconsistent. It's either internally inconsistent with other documents you're submitting, or maybe it's internally inconsistent with the forms that you're submitting. So let me give you some examples so that you know what I'm talking about. First of all, I'm not even talking about cases where someone has a fraudulent relationship. I'm talking about real married couples who really intended to do everything correctly and they have no fraudulent documents or anything. Sometimes there are inconsistencies and you really have to watch out for that. An example would be the forms themselves ask you about your employment history. And so maybe you put your employment history to the best of your recollection on there, and then you also submitted as proof of your financial sponsorship for your spouse a letter from your employer saying that you've been employed there since whatever date, and they don't match. So you need to clarify that inconsistency, because if you don't take the time to really go through those inconsistencies, and that can happen also in things like maybe when you listed your address history, or maybe you had some overlap in your address history where the one place you rented, you had like a couple weeks overlap, and then one of your documents looks like, wait, but aren't they supposed to be living here on this date? Anyway, you just don't want any inconsistencies in your application, so you need to comb through that and make sure that there's nothing there that makes the person reading it confused. You either explain it better, or maybe some things are just, they're true, but they're too confusing, so you choose to use other evidence that just doesn't make it confusing. So inconsistent evidence is a huge, huge problem in immigration cases, and it's an especially big problem because it's one of the top indicators that USCIS looks for when they're trying to figure out if you're lying to them or not. So it's kind of crazy. It's like you might not be lying or lying intentionally at all, and you have a totally legit relationship. But if you submit something inconsistent, that's a rabbit hole they're going to go down. They're going to say, aha, I think they might be lying. This whole thing might be fake. And it turns into a big thing that you just never intended it to turn into. So that's why it's on my big problems list. And finally, number 5 on my top 5 problems list is various types of administrative issues. So that's everything from you mailed the application to the wrong office, because there's an entire web page devoted to all the different addresses that you may have to properly mail this application to, depending on where you live and the various circumstances of what you're filing it with and things like that. So issues with where you send it to, issues with not updating your address if you move after you file the application, or immigration not receiving that, or immigration not confirming that, or having to reschedule your interview date, or having immigration erroneously cancel your date or tell you you didn't show up when you did. There are just a bunch of different ways that administrative type problems can come up, either from your side because you weren't sure how to keep track of it, Or even from immigration side, they make mistakes fairly regularly, honestly, and you have to be on it so that you know to correct them when something's off. So actually, the administrative paperwork type issues are one of the big problems that we do see in this case type. So that's it, the top 5 most common problems that we see with this type of immigration case. Of course, there are many other problems you could have as well, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of what you might run into and helps you take some steps to make sure that you have your best chance of keeping your case on track.